Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our fourth part of the historical context of the book of Daniel. Today, we're going to talk about the fourth and final regime that is involved in the book of Daniel proper. And the challenge with this section is that the Greek period, which is what we're going to talk about today, is not explicitly mentioned in the book of Daniel, but it is critically important for understanding what's going on in Daniel, and especially in the last several chapters of Daniel. So the setting of Daniel, the assumed printed setting of the stories, took place over the course of several kings' reigns. So you had Nebuchadnezzar II, who historically reigned from 605 to 562 BCE. Then you have Belshazzar, who in reality never actually ruled because he was the prince, and his kingdom was conquered before he could become the king. But in the book of Daniel, he is called King Belshazzar, and he was the prince along with his father from who was the actual king, Nabonidus, from 553 to 540 BCE. And then you have someone who is called Darius the Mede, beginning in 539 BCE. Now, we do know, again, that there was no one ever called Darius the Mede. There were several King Dariuses who ruled after Cyrus, but Cyrus the Great was actually the one who conquered the Babylonian Empire as a Persian, and took over and made Babylon part of the Persian Empire beginning in 539 BCE. So we already have some historical inconsistencies with the way that our story is told. The characters who appear, most of them are historical figures or maybe resemble historical figures, but not all of them are represented in a historically accurate way, which is just fine for Daniel, because Daniel's purpose is not to be a historical account. The purpose is to make a theological statement about God. And so it's okay to make some changes to this precise historical events that are being portrayed. So as we move into the Greek period, then we get even an additional level of complexity, because there is no reference to any Greek kings in the book of Daniel in terms of characters who appear in the book being named after any of these rulers. However, critical study of the book has led many scholars to accept that the book of Daniel was completed sometime around the time of the profaning of the temple, which occurred in 167 BCE and was accomplished by Antiochus IV, who was also known as Antiochus the Epiphanes. And he is kind of the mega villain, if you will, of the book of Daniel. We have Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, and to some degree Darius, who are characters who represent that which is opposed to God, that which is opposed to the happiness and success of the Jewish people. But the real villain, at least in terms of the final version of Daniel, is this Antiochus Epiphanes. And so we are going to talk a little bit about the history from the beginning here. We're going to review, and then we'll get more into the Greek period. So here you have a map of the ancient Near East around 600 BCE, which is about 13 years before the Babylonian exile, which occurred in 587 BCE. So you've got the dark green band that kind of looks like an upside down U is the Babylonian Empire, and you can see there that it stretches from the Mediterranean Sea all the way to the Persian Gulf. And then the large yellow area is the Medo-Persian Empire, the empire of the Medes at first, and then the Persians grow up there down at the northern side of the Persian Gulf, gain power, and then end up actually taking over the Median Empire to create the Persian Empire. So just to kind of walk you through historically how things happened here. In 586, 587, the Israelites are taken captive in Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. So that's when the temple is destroyed, Jerusalem is destroyed, the walls are knocked down, a lot of people are killed, and then the ones who remain are taken into exile in Babylon. And they remain in exile in Babylon under the Babylonians until Cyrus the Great of Persia conquers Babylon in 539 BCE. By 538 BCE, just the very next year, the Hebrew exiles were allowed to return to Jerusalem, and several of them did so under a man named Zerubbabel. The Israelites were no longer exiles because they were allowed to return to their homes, but most of them did not return to Jerusalem. So there is a sense in the Bible that, pretty much everybody who was taken away, who still lived, and all of their new families wanted to and did return to Jerusalem. But many of the Israelites did not return, and those who did not return are sometimes referred to as the diaspora, the Jews who live outside of Israel proper, but are still faithful practicing Jews. And that continued for several centuries and continues even today. Then in 458, so about 80 years later, another group of exiles returned to Jerusalem under a man named Ezra, who is the name of the book of Ezra is after this particular person. And then another 25 years after that, a final group of exiles returned to Jerusalem under Nehemiah, again, familiar from the book of Nehemiah. So there were 3 different waves of Jewish immigration back across the former Babylonian Empire to return to Jerusalem to restore their previous lives. And then in 332 BCE, 100 years after that final group of exiles returned, Alexander III, who is also known as Alexander the Great, conquered Judah, defeating the Persian Empire. So it was about 100 years after that final group returned that the Persian Empire no longer exists, and now the Greeks take over. So here we have a picture of Alexander's entry into Babylon, considered to be the end of Persia when Babylon falls. In 323, Alexander died, and there were wars fought over the right of succession. Alexander did not have a direct heir, and so his empire was divided into pieces. And Palestine, the area where the Jews were trying to reestablish themselves, came under the rule of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which was centered in Egypt. So one of the 4 areas that 4 people that got control, one of them was Ptolemy, and Ptolemy was centered in Egypt. He was one of Alexander's generals who earned his way through warfare into having this piece of Alexander's conquests. So then in 196 BCE, so we're talking more than 100 years later, Antiochus III and Philip V of Macedon defeated Ptolemy V in battle. And so now, instead of being under the Ptolemaic dynasty, Palestine transfers to control by the Seleucids, and they are centered in Macedonia. So we've got, at first they are kind of part of what is, it's called the Ptolemaic dynasty, but it's essentially Egypt. And then they kind of change hands via this battle, and now Palestine is under the rule of the Seleucid Empire, centered in Macedonia. This is nothing particularly new for the Jews. If you remember back to the map with the Babylonian Empire in green, there is a big gap below that upside down U where there is nothing. And there's a reason for that. Nobody wanted that space because that was a desert. And so if you were trying to travel from Egypt up into Greece or Persia or toward Babylon, you had to travel through Israel, through the area of the Jews and Jerusalem to get there. And so if you were trying to conquer one of those people because you were on the other side and wanted more land and more power, you had to conquer the Palestinian area first. And so there was a lot of conflict over the course of centuries, and at this time, it's no different. So the changing of control in Palestine is certainly not new, but it creates more and more upheaval for the people who are living there. So finally, in 175, Antiochus IV, who is also called Antiochus Epiphanes, came to power. And he is not somebody that is typically well known by the average Christian, but he is incredibly important for the book of Daniel and incredibly important even for the history of the Jewish people. He was not a friend to the Jews. He was a really nasty guy. He did all sorts of things to provoke the people that he had conquered. And in 167 BCE, he decided that he was going to punish and subdue and humiliate the Jews by desecrating the temple of God in Jerusalem. And so he had a pig slaughtered on the altar there, and pigs are unclean animals, and so obviously that is something that was not received well by the Jews, and so that kind of set off a rebellion. And a group called the Hasmoneans, who were Jewish, fought back, and in 166 they wrested control from Antiochus's government. And then in 164, about 3 years after the profaning of the temple, the Hasmoneans cleansed and rededicated the temple. And then it's believed that about a year after that, in 163, the book of Daniel was completed into its present form with all 12 chapters, all the stories put into their current order with the current details that are included in those stories. And then in 139 BCE, Israel became its own independent kingdom, separate from the control of any other nation, any other power. And so you'll note that from 587 BCE to 139 BCE, the Israelites did not have their own control. They did not have their own king. They were subject to foreign powers. So that's a very long time to be controlled in that way, especially since, as a Jew, you were supposed to believe that God had all this power and that God was putting the people in charge of you, over you. David was chosen, anointed by God. And so why is this happening to us for all these years? That we are being oppressed by these foreign nations who don't worship our God, who worship pagan idols and are clearly inferior to us in culture and in following God's law and in worshiping the one true God. So in 139, when Israel became its own kingdom, the leader of the Jewish people, Simon Maccabeus, visited Rome, and he actually was able to get the Roman Senate to recognize the Hasmonean dynasty as a legitimate kingdom, and was able to tenuously get their independence and be safe from invasion by the Romans. But of course, we all know that didn't last very long. So backing up just a little bit, I wanted to talk a little bit more about Alexander in more detail. Under Alexander the Great and the Ptolemaic kings from 332 to 198 BCE, the Jewish people were more or less kind of living as they had been. They were conquered and all that, and they were allowed to stay where they were living. And then they were connected to, after Alexander died, he was only the emperor of this whole vast region for 13 years, because after he conquered the Babylonian Empire and conquered Jerusalem, he ended up dying in 323. And so he didn't last too long, but the Ptolemaic dynasty kind of continued his policies on. So things were pretty okay for the Jews. Here in the image, you've got a portion of the Alexander mosaic that was found in Pompeii. It depicts Alexander in battle. And then on the left side there, you've got a cameo that depicts Alexander the Great with horns like a goat. Alexander doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible that we have. He is mentioned once by name in the book of First Maccabees, and we don't have the books of Maccabees in our Bible, but they do appear in the Catholic Bible. This picture of Alexander as a goat is interesting, though, because in Daniel chapter 8, verse 5, there is the image of a male goat with a large horn. And so the connection of Alexander with the image of the goat is clearly something that historically happened in the culture. And so when we read Daniel chapter 8, we know that that male goat is supposed to be referring to Alexander. But the wars that came after Alexander died, while the generals were battling over who was going to succeed him and who was going to get what area, just absolutely devastated Palestine. Because, like I said, in order to get to your enemy in Egypt, or to get to your enemy in Greece, or to get to your enemy in Macedonia, or to get to your enemy in the area of what is now Iraq or Iran, you have to go through Palestine. So there was a lot of upheaval there, but the empire eventually was divided into several parts, and we see evidence of that again in Daniel chapter 8, and that's in verse 8. So when we get to there, we'll be able to take a look at that a little bit more closely. So here is a map showing the divisions of Alexander's empire after his death. So all of the colors there, other than the yellow, are the full scope of Alexander's empire. And you can see it's divided by colors into the different regions. So you've got the orange is the Ptolemaic kingdom, that includes Jerusalem as part of the Ptolemaic dynasty, so that they are connected to Egypt. And then you see the green is the Seleucid kingdom that eventually did conquer the Ptolemaic kingdom and take over Palestine. So Alexander's death is recognized as the beginning of what we call the Hellenistic period, which was a time during which lots of people adopted the language, the alphabet, the customs, and the philosophy of ancient Greece. Alexander kind of homogenized the known world, if you will. And Hellenization was facilitated by the Greek practice of starting colonies among the conquered peoples. So instead of bringing the conquered peoples away from their homes and making them live elsewhere in remote outposts or in the capital themselves, they would take people who were natives and citizens of their city-states, and they would send them out to colonize the conquered peoples and bring their culture to them rather than bringing them to another culture. Under the Ptolemaic kings, a lot remained the way that it had been under the Persians. Like I said, the Jews remained submissive, and it was relatively peaceful. There wasn't a lot of revolt. There wasn't a lot of uprising. But relative is an important word here because, again, like I mentioned, Palestine being that little orange piece that kind of juts out toward the east of the Egyptian part of the map there proper, that's where Palestine is, and it acted as a bridge between all of these warring empires. So Macedonia and the Seleucids to the north, and Egypt and the Ptolemies to the south were constantly fighting with each other. And unfortunately for the Jews in Palestine, their area was kind of the battleground most of the time. They're in the middle. During this time, a lot of Jews immigrated to Egypt because those were the people who were ruling them, so they were allowed to travel in that direction. And of course, moving further into the kingdom gave them a little bit more security and peace because they weren't in that space where they were on the outskirts of the kingdom, constantly being threatened by the Seleucids and their invasions. And so many Jews immigrated into Egypt, and especially a lot of people ended up in Alexandria. And here you've got an image of the famous lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, that was located in Alexandria. Alexandria was a center of Greek culture during this time, and there were more Jews outside of Palestine than inside of Palestine at this time. So that diaspora I mentioned before was huge, and the Bible wants us to believe that it was the most important thing to go back to Jerusalem, but so many Jews in reality did not feel that way. They felt that their families had grown up in this space, and their children understood this culture better and this language better. And so they tried to find ways that they could continue to serve their God and practice their religion outside of Jerusalem. Greek became the common language of the empire, and so the Jews in the diaspora began to lose their Hebrew. The Jews in Alexandria, most of them couldn't speak Hebrew anymore. Many of them could still read it, but the daily speech of Hebrew turned to Greek as they enculturated into this Hellenized culture. And so between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE, scribes in Alexandria translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. And this text is today known as the Septuagint and is often used to kind of study the ancient versions of the Hebrew scriptures, because the version that Jews use today is actually from the early Middle Ages, when they finally decided that they were just going to accept this particular version as the canon going forward. So the Septuagint has some different and interesting elements to it that the modern scriptures do not. Additionally, it's important to note that the Jews living in the Hellenized areas were sometimes embarrassed by their ancient laws, and so they didn't practice in the same ways that they would have if they had lived in Jerusalem. And so Judaism looked different in these areas than they would have in Jerusalem, in Judea itself, and certainly looked a lot different than it did before the Babylonians conquered and removed them from their homeland. In terms of who was affected by this, certainly the upper classes, those with more money, more influence, were the first ones affected by the Hellenization. But all people were affected to some degree by the transmission of culture and this intense activity toward Hellenizing the entirety of basically the known world at that time. So let's now move into the Seleucids a little bit. So in the Seleucid Empire to the north, Antiochus III, who was also known as Antiochus the Great, inherited a disorganized state. Here you can see some coins depicting Antiochus III that are held at the British Museum. The one on the right is there, excuse me. And his entire rule was taken up with fighting, wars, and squelching rebellions, and just constantly fighting. In 217 BCE, he attacked Egypt, and he was rebuffed by Ptolemy IV. And then in 205 BCE, Ptolemy IV died, and an infant was crowned the king in Egypt. And so Antiochus agreed to split the Ptolemaic possessions with Philip V of Macedon, who was one of the kings of another piece of Alexander's empire to the northwest. So Philip V and Antiochus III decided that they were going to split the Ptolemaic possessions. They were going to conquer it together and split them in half. And so in 198 BCE, Antiochus defeated Scopas, who was the general who was fighting for the Ptolemaic kingdom, and so he gained control of Judea. So Antiochus III actually treated the Jews pretty well because they showed support for his takeover. So he did not tax Jerusalem for 3 years so that he could allow the city to recover from the war. And temple officials were completely exempt from taxation. Many Jewish captives were returned to their homes after the war ended, and Jewish law was maintained. They were not asked to change their culture, change their laws. However, after the death of Antiochus III, son Seleucus reigned from 187 to 185. And due to financial necessity, Seleucus pursued an ambitious policy of taxation. He repealed the exemption for the Jewish temple, and after reigning for only 12 years, Seleucus IV was assassinated. And so now there's a little bit of kind of fishy royal intrigue here. Seleucus had a valid heir, but his brother Antiochus, who then was now known as Antiochus IV, took control of the Seleucid state. and he reigned from 175 to 163 BCE. Here on the left, you can see Antiochus. He was called Antiochus Epiphanes on one side, and then Zeus enthroned on the other side of the coin. Antiochus Epiphanes was not anything like his father. He did not like the Jews. He really didn't like anyone. He felt threatened by the power of Rome, and so he endorsed Hellenism and the worship of Zeus. He identified himself with Zeus as the highest and most powerful god, and he kind of forced the Hellenized ideas and worship of Zeus on his conquered people. And unlike most of the other peoples that Antiochus conquered, the Jews were not able to reconcile worshiping Zeus with the worship of their god Yahweh. And so tensions over this forced Hellenization grew within the Jewish community within Palestine. Shortly after coming to power, Antiochus accepted a fee from Jason, who was the brother of the high priest Onias, to make Jason high priest. So Jason bribed Antiochus to make him an illegitimate high priest in place of his brother Onias. And so there is intrigue going on, not just in terms of how Antiochus becomes the king of the Seleucids, but also now there is intrigue going on in terms of how Jason became the high priest and got the religious power in Jerusalem and in Palestine. So 3 years later, Menelaus, who was another Jewish man, paid an even higher bribe to Antiochus, and he replaced Jason. And then in 171 BCE, Onias was murdered. And this is the story of what happens in 2 Maccabees chapter 4. Finally, in 168 BCE, Antiochus's ambition led him to attack Egypt. And unfortunately for him, Egypt was defended by Rome, his bitter enemy. And so his campaign proved unsuccessful. And hearing rumors that Antiochus had died in battle, Jason forcibly reclaimed the office of high priest from Menelaus. So he grabbed back that political and religious power. Jason heard this rumor that Antiochus died, but it was actually not true. So he has just been humiliated in battle. You know, Antiochus, as you can probably tell, is kind of an arrogant guy. He is now humiliated. He cannot tolerate the fact that he has lost this battle. And now he is very tired of the Jews and their infighting for religious and political jockeying. And so he decides that he is going to go to Jerusalem on his way home from his failed campaign into Egypt, and he just absolutely releases his fury. So here in the image, you see a copper engraving of the sack of Jerusalem. So this is when, as I said, the temple was plundered and desecrated. Antiochus sacrificed a pig on the altar of the Lord, which completely profaned it. Antiochus murdered Jewish men who would not eat the pig that had been sacrificed, and the cult of Zeus was introduced into the temple. The walls of the city were once again torn down, and the practice of Judaism was effectively forbidden in the entire region. So if you were a Jew who decided to stick it out and stay in Jerusalem so that you could practice your religion as freely as possible, that was no longer the case. You had lost everything. And many people, were killed because they wouldn't participate in the new cult. So here, this isn't a great image, but it's very old, and the painting is from the synagogue of Dura Europos, and shows the treasures of the temple lying scattered in the street, while the tabernacle on its wheel carriage is removed to safety. So they did remove the tabernacle that contains the holiest objects. But Torah scrolls were burned, circumcision was forbidden, the Sabbath was outlawed, participation in Greek religious festivals was required, was mandatory, Jews were forced to eat pork, and the penalty for keeping the Jewish law was execution. In a further attempt to subdue the Jews, Antiochus IV built what is called the Acra, and the Acra was a fortress within the city of Jerusalem. It was a colonial outpost of Hellenized pagans and also Jews. And it probably stood on a hill in the center of the city, higher than the temple, which of course in itself is a sacrilege. And among the Jews, there were a lot of different responses to all of this humiliation that they experienced under the hand of the angry Antiochus IV. Those who had been fully Hellenized already just continued in their compliance. They didn't care that this was happening. They probably felt that those Jews who refused to comply were, kind of asking for it. Other groups, known as the Hasidim, chose resistance. Hasidim is a Hebrew word that means pious ones or righteous ones. And so they worked to undermine and fight against these new laws. Beginning in 166 BCE, you see the Hasmonean period of the history of Israel. And this part of the history of Israel is only accounted for in First and Second Maccabees and by the Jewish historian Josephus. So we don't see this history recorded anywhere else other than from those two sources. The Hasmonean period, like I said, began in 166 BCE. After Antiochus issued the decree that made it illegal to practice Judaism, the Jews started a revolt. They were led by Mattathias, who was a Hasmonean, and his 5 sons. So here you can see a depiction of Mattathias and his 5 sons battling the Greeks and their war elephants. And being a priest, Mattathias was ordered to make an offering to an idol. He refused, and he killed the man who offered to do it in his place. There was a man who said, "Oh, well, I'll do it." And he said, "No way, I'm not letting you do that." So here is the picture of that incident. So after he killed that man, then Mattathias and his 5 sons fled to the wilderness, where they were joined by other displaced Jews who maintained their piety, maintained their Jewishness, and wanted to continue to follow the law. And so they lived in the wilderness. So here is a depiction of the Hasmoneans fleeing to the hills. And as their numbers grew, this group of what they were calling themselves exiles began a campaign of guerrilla warfare. So they killed Seleucids, they killed Hellenized Jews, they forcibly circumcised the children of Jews that they came upon. So even if you weren't of the Hasmoneans, you could be traveling across the road and have your children kidnapped and forcibly circumcised, and they would destroy pagan altars. After the death of Mattathias, his son Judas took command and led an army against the Seleucids. So here is an image of Judas Maccabeus on horseback. The Jewish army actually, was powerful enough to defeat Antiochus's army, and they were probably able to accomplish this because Antiochus was kind of preoccupied on another front. They defeated the Seleucid army twice, and then later actually defeated them 2 more times. So they were pretty successful. In 164 BCE, the Hasmoneans cleansed the temple. The old altar was torn down and a new one was built. And kind of as an aside, this is the period when the celebration of Hanukkah began with the miracle of the lights. So this is the period also when many scholars agree that the book of Daniel, as we now have it, was completed in the time between the desecration of the temple and its cleansing. So between 167 and 164. And it was written to reassure the persecuted Jews that God is in control no matter how chaotic and difficult it is to comprehend historical events, no matter how tough things might appear, no matter how long their suffering might endure. So the themes that the Jews saw in these stories of Daniel, going back even to the Babylonian period, are once again of help to them as they face this desperate oppression and persecution. And so throughout the book of Daniel, the reason why it is assumed that it was finalized in the current form during this period is because there are many thinly veiled references to Antiochus throughout the book. And I'm going to just mention a few of them here. The first one is the portrayal of the idolatrous Belshazzar drinking from the temple articles in Daniel chapter 5. That idea of profaning the sacred elements and items certainly goes in with the profaning of the temple by Antiochus Epiphanes. And then in Daniel chapter 7, we have the image of the little horn with eyes and a mouth that speaks arrogantly. So that one, according to scholars, is pretty clearly Antiochus Epiphanes. Then we get the little horn that grew to heaven and threw down some of the host of heaven in Daniel chapter 8. And here's an image of that horn. And then the portrayal of the contemptible person on whom royal majesty has not been conferred in Daniel chapter 11, verses 21 to 45. So throughout the book of Daniel, we see God's gracious response to those who are humble before God. God enters into their suffering with them, responds to their supplication, and often is there with them even before their prayers are even uttered. And certainly during a time of intense persecution by someone as powerful as Antiochus Epiphanes and as unstable as Antiochus Epiphanes, you can see why the story of Daniel and these stories from the Babylonian Empire and the Persian Empire would be compelling to them, and why they would be important for them as they look for hope, look for means to continue moving forward toward hopefully eventually being restored as their own kingdom. So that brings us to the end of the Greek period. I hope this was helpful for you, and I look forward to seeing you in class soon. Thanks very much.